Some wars begin with speeches. Some with assassinations. Some with lines in the sand. But the war that would determine the fate of Europe, its borders, its people, its future, began with a single moment of pure, blinding light at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941. In that instant, the largest invasion force in human history opened fire, and the world changed forever. You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story. Dr. Heinrich Harper stood framed in the ragged doorway of a collapsing barn, the splintered wood groaning as icy wind pushed against it. Snow drifted through cracks in the roof like sifted flour, coating the floor in a thin white dust. The breath from Harper's mouth crystallized instantly, forming tiny clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. He rubbed his hands together, more from habit than hope. In this cold, nothing warmed. Nothing healed. Nothing lived for long. Before him trudged the shattered remnants of the 252nd Infantry Division. Months earlier, these men had marched east proud and strong, part of the greatest invasion force Europe had ever seen. Now, they moved through waist-deep snow like ghosts tethered to failing bodies. Harper felt his chest tighten watching them. This was not retreat, it was collapse. Uniforms were no longer uniforms. Tunics had frayed into strips, greatcoats stolen from fallen Soviet soldiers hung from shoulders like mismatched skins, and trousers were patched with cloth ripped from tents, blankets, even dead horses. Many men limped on makeshift wrappings of newspaper, rope, and wire, boots long lost to mud, fire, or frost. The worst walked barefoot, their toes blackened into lifeless lumps. Harper had seen frostbite before, but nothing like this. Here, flesh didn't just die, it decayed while still attached. One soldier passed slowly, cradling his right hand inside his tunic. Harper recognized the signs, the gray fingertips, the trembling lip, the silent dread. By morning, that hand would be gone. He knew it. The soldier likely knew it too. Behind them, the sky pulsed with unnatural color, orange, red, and violet white flashes. Moscow's artillery. Harper listened, counting the seconds between distant rumbles and the faint metallic grind of T-34 engines echoing across the plains. There was no mistaking that sound. The Soviets were closing in, moving with confidence, momentum, and numbers the Germans no longer had. Harper swallowed the rising knot in his throat. 6 months ago, the German army was certain of swift victory. They were told the Soviet Union would fall quickly, 10 weeks, maybe 12. But now, in the freezing dark, it was clear how wrong those predictions had been. And as he watched his division fade into the swirling snow, Harper realized something chilling. They were not being defeated by winter. They had already been defeated long before the cold arrived. 6 months earlier, the world outside the Reich Chancellery had been quiet. Snow fell gently across Berlin, blanketing statues and rooftops in peaceful white. Inside, however, the atmosphere was tight and electric, every breath sharpened by the weight of what was about to be decided. Hitler stood before a massive, illuminated map table that dominated the room. Red arrows already marked planned routes of advance, blue symbols represented Soviet positions that German intelligence insisted were weak, disorganized, and slow. Around Hitler stood the highest-ranking military minds in Germany, Halder with his meticulous notebooks, Keitel standing rigid with forced confidence, Jodl quiet and calculating. Hitler lifted a pointer and tapped the map. "Destroy the Soviet Union in one swift blow," he declared, sliding the pointer from the German border to Minsk, then Smolensk, and finally Moscow. 8 weeks. 10 at most. His generals exchanged fleeting glances, too quick for Hitler to see, too cautious to form open dissent. They knew the Soviet Union was vast, its industrial capacity uncertain, its railways incompatible with German supply trains. But they also remembered Poland, France, Norway. Every campaign had fallen faster than their worst-case estimates. Blitzkrieg had worked everywhere. Hitler continued, voice rising with certainty. This campaign will break the back of Bolshevism. Britain will lose hope. Germany will secure the future it deserves. No one objected. Not openly. Not when careers and lives hung in the balance. So Directive Number 21, Operation Barbarossa, was signed, stamped, and distributed. A war of unimaginable size and brutality had been set in motion, not by necessity, not by defense, but by ideology and arrogance. And months later, Harper would watch its consequences unfold in the frozen fields outside Moscow. In June 1941, when the first German soldiers stepped across the Soviet border, the mood had been almost celebratory. Commanders told their men they would have victory secured before the first autumn leaves fell. Letters home spoke of confidence and destiny. Young soldiers joked about seeing Moscow before the year ended. Even the propaganda films, bright, triumphant, full of marching columns, promised a short, glorious campaign. But the truth revealed itself slowly. First, the distances were longer than expected. Roads were mud and dust. Supply lines stretched thin. Soviet units that were supposed to crumble instead regrouped and counterattacked. A campaign designed to end quickly dragged into weeks, then months. The summer burned away. Autumn rains drowned everything. Winter arrived like a predator. By December, the promise of rapid victory lay buried under snow along with thousands of German soldiers. The army that had been told it was unstoppable was now frozen in place, starving, breaking apart. Harper saw it in their faces: regret, confusion, disbelief. They had marched east believing they would conquer a collapsing empire. Instead, they found an enemy that refused to die, a land that swallowed them whole, and a reality their leaders had refused to consider. The real defeat had begun not on the battlefield, but in that brightly lit room in Berlin, where no one questioned the fantasy. At 3:15 a.m., the world east of the Bug River did not wake gently, it woke violently. The night, moments earlier heavy with silence, exploded into a blinding white flash that stretched across the entire horizon, transforming darkness into a harsh, unnatural daylight. German artillery, thousands of guns lined up wheel to wheel, opened fire in perfect synchronicity. The blast didn't sound like gunfire. It was deeper, heavier, a rolling thunder that seemed to rise from underground. The shockwave lifted dust, smoke, and even loose snow completely off the ground. Soviet wooden watchtowers shattered instantly, their splinters thrown into the sky like kindling. Villages miles away shook as windows blew inward. Horses panicked. Birds erupted into the sky. Even the clouds flickered with the fire below. Lieutenant Nikolai Pavlov, stationed at a border outpost, had been writing a routine weather entry just moments before. Now the bunker trembled violently. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The lamps crashed and shattered at his feet. He stumbled outside into a nightmare illuminated by fire, his outpost half collapsed, nearby structures burning, and the forest glowing orange from artillery blasts. Then came the sound that chilled him more than anything, the low, mechanical growl of engines. Dozens, then hundreds. German panzers. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and the Soviet Union's long night had only just started. As dawn crept in, the sky filled with wings, Luftwaffe dive bombers, and fighters sweeping over Soviet territory in perfect formation. Their mission was not air superiority, it was annihilation. Stalin had forbidden Soviet aircraft from dispersing, fearing that moving planes would provoke Germany. As a result, airfields across the western USSR were packed with neatly lined rows of fighters and bombers. To German pilots, it was a dream target. The first Stukas screamed downward with sirens wailing, dropping bombs directly onto Soviet runways. Aircraft burst into flames in domino-like succession. Fuel storage tanks detonated in massive fireballs that rolled across tarmac and engulfed hangars. Soviet pilots raced from barracks barefoot, some still in underwear or half-button uniforms. They tried to pull burning planes out of danger, tried to push others toward cover, tried desperately to get a few airborne. But nothing could be saved. In a single day, the Luftwaffe destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most without ever leaving the ground. Smoke rose from dozens of airfields across Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics, columns so tall they looked like black pillars holding up the morning sky. For the Soviet Air Force, June 22 was not just a defeat. It was a decapitation. On the ground, the German armored spearheads surged forward like four enormous steel fists, Panzer Groups 1, 2, 3, and 4, crashing into Soviet defenses with speed the world had never seen. Panzers advanced in wedge formations, slicing through the frontier. Motorized infantry followed in trucks and half-tracks. Engineers bridged rivers in minutes. Motorcycle units roared ahead, scouting and relaying positions. Columns of armor stretched to the horizon. Within hours, Soviet frontline divisions were shattered. Within the first day, some German units advanced 20 to 30 kilometers. By midday, pockets of Soviet soldiers were already surrounded, cut off, or fleeing blind. Yet amidst the chaos, one place stunned the Germans. Brest Fortress. A stone island of resistance. German commanders expected to take it in a few hours. Instead, it withstood constant bombardment, infantry assaults, flamethrowers, and armored attacks. Soviet defenders, soldiers, border guards, and even families, fought room by room, hall by hall, refusing to abandon the fortress even as walls collapsed. Carved into the brick, found months later. I am dying, but I do not surrender. By nightfall of June 22, the scale of the invasion was unmistakable. 3.8 million Axis troops. 3,600 tanks. 7,000 artillery pieces. 2,500 aircraft. 1,800 miles of front. The largest invasion the world had ever witnessed. The German High Command believed they had just begun a victory that would reshape the continent. But in the smoke above Brest, in the bodies scattered along the frontier, and in the fading cries from burning outposts, history whispered a different truth. Germany had awakened something far more powerful, vast, and determined than they understood. The reports that reached Moscow on the morning of June 23, 1941 made no sense, at least, not to men who still believed Germany would never dare invade while fighting Britain. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin spent most of that morning in stony silence, chain-smoking cigarettes, his hands trembling subtly as generals read dispatch after dispatch. Sectors wiped out. Divisions surrounded. Airfields destroyed. German armor pushing 40 kilometers deep, in a single day. Stalin demanded confirmation. Provocation, he muttered. This must be provocation. But the truth was undeniable. By noon, even the NKVD confirmed the invasion was real. Inside the Soviet General Staff headquarters, the atmosphere bordered on hysteria. Generals argued loudly, some demanding immediate counterattacks, others insisting on pulling back and forming defensive lines. Maps that had once been orderly now sprawled across floors and tables marked with red pins indicating German penetration, pins that moved eastward faster than anyone could reposition them. Western Front Commander Dmitry Pavlov, calling from Minsk, was nearly shouting through the crackling line, "We need reserves. Armor. Air support. We cannot hold these positions." But Moscow had no reserves ready. Most were deep inside Soviet territory, unprepared, unmobilized, scattered across thousands of kilometers. Stalin walked out of the command room and vanished into his office for hours. For the first time in decades, the man feared by Europe seemed paralyzed. The Soviet Union had not just been attacked, it had been surprised, disoriented, and dismembered in less than 24 hours. And as German spearheads continued slicing eastward, the Soviet leadership finally understood the scale of what they faced. While Moscow struggled with shock, the battlefield moved with terrifying speed. Along the frontier near Bialystok and Minsk, German armor executed one of the most devastating encirclements in military history. Panzer Group 2 under Heinz Guderian drove from the south. Panzer Group 3 under Hoth swept from the north. Their goal: close the ring around the Soviet Western Front. By June 25, the jaws of the trap were snapping shut. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, border guards, infantry divisions, tank brigades, reserve units, found themselves crushed into a tightening pocket. Supplies ran out almost immediately. Ammunition had to be stripped from broken vehicles. Soviet tanks often engaged German panzers with half-crews or no radio communication. The fields near Ruzhny, Slonim, and Novogrudok burned continuously for days, smoke so thick that German aircraft lost visibility. The landscape was littered with destroyed Soviet BT-7 and T-26 tanks, many abandoned due to fuel shortages rather than combat losses. Yet the Soviets fought ferociously. Some units held crossroads for hours against overwhelming odds. Others attempted desperate nighttime breakouts through swamps and forests. Civilians joined the chaos, guiding Soviet soldiers through marsh paths, smuggling wounded men into barns, or hiding stragglers. But the disaster could not be reversed. On June 28, Minsk fell. By July 3, the encirclement was complete. Nearly 300,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies, the 3rd, 4th, and 10th, ceased to exist. The Germans advanced so fast that their supply trucks struggled to keep up with the panzers. Roads clogged with abandoned Soviet equipment, wreckage, and prisoners marching west under guard. The victory was total. But it was also deceptive. Germany believed this meant the Soviet Union was collapsing. In reality, it was only the opening act of a far longer war. While German commanders celebrated their rapid victories, a different kind of storm was gathering inside the Soviet lines. Stalin, shaken but now resolute, issued Order No. 2. All forces to launch counterattacks immediately. It was a fatal order. Soviet units, barely assembled and poorly coordinated, were sent charging blindly at German armor already deeply entrenched. Tank divisions with outdated T-26 and BT-7 vehicles collided against panzer formations with superior coordination, radios, and mobility. The results were catastrophic. But something important changed. Soviet soldiers stopped surrendering easily. Fewer broke and ran. More fought to the last magazine. More used scorched earth tactics, burning crops, destroying equipment, evacuating factories eastward. Retreat did not mean collapse. Retreat meant regrouping. Entire cities began evacuating industrial machinery, thousands of locomotives hauling factories east toward the Urals. It was an extraordinary logistical effort, one of the largest migrations of industrial power ever attempted, and it would save the Soviet Union in the long run. On the front lines, morale remained shrouded in misery and confusion. But anger replaced shock. A determination to fight replaced disbelief. Soviet political officers spread through the ranks, organizing resistance and harsh discipline. Meanwhile, German commanders, blinded by early success, failed to notice the shift. They believed victory was only weeks away. They believed Soviet reserves were exhausted. They believed the war was almost over. They were wrong. The Soviet Union was not dying. It was awakening. By early July 1941, the German High Command was euphoric. The victories at Bialystok and Minsk seemed to confirm everything Hitler had predicted. Newspapers in Berlin ran triumphant headlines. Generals bragged in their journals that the Red Army has been defeated in the field. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels wrote privately, "The collapse of the Soviet Union is only a matter of days." Inside the Führer headquarters at Rassenburg, Hitler addressed his senior staff with unusual confidence. He gestured to maps filled with German arrows surging toward the heart of European Russia. "Gentlemen," he announced, "the enemy is broken. We need only drive forward." Many of his generals agreed. The Soviet casualties were staggering, the encirclements unprecedented. German columns were advancing more than 25 miles per day, something no previous army in history had achieved over such distances. But there were troubling signs. Supply lines were fraying. Fuel trucks struggled to reach spearheads that had driven too far ahead. Roads that looked solid on maps were little more than dirt tracks churned into ruts by thousands of vehicles. Tanks suffered mechanical breakdowns. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, collapsed from exhaustion. Still, the optimism at headquarters drowned out these warnings. The focus turned to the next objective, Smolensk, the last major city on the road to Moscow. German commanders believed capturing it would destroy the remaining Soviet Western armies and open the final highway to victory. They expected resistance. But not what awaited them. The Red Army was supposed to be finished. Instead, at Smolensk, it dug in and prepared for a fight unlike anything Germany had encountered so far. On July 10, 1941, the German advance collided with a Soviet defense that shocked them. Stalin had finally begun mobilizing reserves in depth, new armies formed in haste from training academies, militia units, remnants of shattered divisions, and reinforcements pulled from deep inside the USSR. 3 Soviet armies, the 16th, 19th, and 20th, threw themselves into the path of the German panzer groups trying to encircle Smolensk. The fighting was savage. In forests west of Yartsevo, German motorized infantry found themselves ambushed by Soviet tanks emerging from tree lines at close range. At night, Soviet troops launched desperate bayonet charges to recover lost ground. Villages changed hands multiple times in a single day. The Soviets lacked coordination, radios, and often ammunition, but they compensated with sheer will. German officers began reporting something new. The Russians do not retreat. They fight from every position. Even burning tanks continue to fire until the last shell. The Soviet T-34 also made one of its earliest major appearances at Smolensk. Its sloped armor resisted German anti-tank rounds, and its mobility over rough ground shocked German crews accustomed to easy victories. Panzer Commander Hans von Locke recalled, "We were stunned. Suddenly the battlefield belonged to them, not us." Still, the Germans tightened the noose. By late July, another massive encirclement formed around Smolensk, over 150,000 Soviet soldiers trapped inside. For Germany, it was another tactical victory. But unlike Minsk and Bialystok, the Soviets did not collapse. They counterattacked relentlessly, forcing the Germans into a grinding battle of attrition that cost precious time Hitler had not planned to spend. By early August, Smolensk was finally in German hands, but the victory felt hollow. The city lay in smoking ruins. German casualties were mounting. Vehicles broke down in increasing numbers. And the Soviet army, despite losing hundreds of thousands, remained unbroken. Even worse, fresh Soviet armies were arriving. The Red Army was replacing losses faster than Germany could advance. Generals like Heinz Guderian and Fedor von Bock pleaded. "We must push toward Moscow now, before the enemy regroups." They were right. But Hitler disagreed. Obsessed with capturing Ukraine's agricultural wealth and Leningrad's symbolic value, Hitler ordered the armored spearheads to split, sending some north to Leningrad, others south to Kiev, and only part of the original force remaining aimed at Moscow. It was a strategic disaster in the making. The German high command was stunned. Splitting the panzers meant the already delayed drive on Moscow would slow even further. The original timetable, capturing Moscow before the autumn rains, was now impossible. Meanwhile, the Soviets seized the moment. Factories in Leningrad, Moscow, and Kharkov ran day and night. Entire machine shops uprooted and relocated east. New armies formed behind the Volga. Siberian divisions quietly prepared for redeployment. Germany, unaware, believed Soviet reserves were finished. But at Smolensk, the signs were already clear. The Red Army was not dying. It was multiplying. And for the first time in the war, the German advance slowed, not because of defeat, but because of something worse. Strategic miscalculation. The road to Moscow was still open. But the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. As German forces split after Smolensk, the Northern Army groups surged toward Leningrad, the birthplace of the Russian Revolution and the symbolic heart of Soviet identity. Hitler was obsessed with its capture, believing the city's fall would shatter Soviet morale. By early August 1941, German and Finnish forces were tightening a noose around the city. The Soviet leadership rushed reinforcements into the Leningrad region, including militia units composed of factory workers, teachers, teenagers, and the elderly, anyone capable of holding a rifle. They dug trenches. They built barricades from overturned trams. They fortified parks, boulevards, apartment blocks, and even the gardens of the historic Winter Palace. The people of Leningrad understood what was coming long before the rest of the world did. On September 8, the final supply route, the Schlisselburg Corridor, fell. Leningrad was officially surrounded. German artillery began hammering the city. Fuel stores burst into flames. Food warehouses were destroyed. Streets filled with debris. Civilians rushed to fill bathtubs and buckets with water before the pipes froze. Hitler gave explicit orders. The city must be erased. No surrender terms. But the Soviets refused to give up. The Red Army, reinforced by civilians turned fighters, held the lines. Women operated anti-aircraft guns. Children carried ammunition. Entire factories were relocated underground to continue producing weapons even during bombardments. Yet the siege had begun, and what would follow would become one of the longest and deadliest sieges in human history. The northern diversion was costly, but Hitler saw it as necessary. What he failed to understand was that every day spent at Leningrad made the Moscow timetable bleed away. While Leningrad endured shelling in the north, the southern front became the site of the largest encirclement battle in military history. General Heinz Guderian and his elite panzer group were redirected south, much to his frustration, to assist Army Group South in capturing Kiev. Guderian protested the diversion bitterly, insisting that splitting the panzers was sabotaging the final push toward Moscow. Hitler disagreed. He wanted Ukraine's agricultural wealth and the destruction of Soviet forces defending Kiev. In late August, German armor executed a massive pincer movement. From the north, Guderian's tanks drove south of Gomel. From the south, Kleist's panzer group advanced north of Kremenchuk. The jaws of the trap snapped shut by mid-September. Inside the pocket, nearly 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. The fighting was brutal. Soviet units resisted fiercely, launching desperate breakout attempts through forests, marshes, and cornfields. But the German lines held. Ammunition ran out. Food ran out. Eventually, the encircled forces collapsed. The scale stunned even the Germans. One senior officer wrote, "We have never seen so many prisoners in one place. The roads are clogged with them." Propaganda in Berlin celebrated the victory as proof of Soviet collapse. Yet beneath the triumph lay a deeper truth. The Kiev victory cost Germany precious weeks during which Soviet defenses near Moscow hardened, reserves mobilized, and factories continued operating at full capacity. The largest encirclement in world history had been achieved. But it was bought with the only currency Germany could not afford to spend: time. While German forces were consumed in the north and south, something unexpected happened around Moscow. The Soviets regrouped. General Zhukov, newly appointed to the defense of Moscow, began reorganizing battered divisions, pulling reserve troops from across the Soviet Union, and reinforcing defensive belts around the capital. Anti-tank ditches were dug by hundreds of thousands of civilians. Barricades sprang up on highways. Entire neighborhoods formed volunteer battalions. Even factories in Moscow were converted into fortresses. Machine tools were moved east, but assembly lines continued operating until the last possible moment, workers producing weapons by day and digging defenses by night. Meanwhile, the German army, victorious but exhausted, was stretched thin. Fuel shortages worsened. Vehicles broke down. Infantry units marched barefoot or on rag-wrapped feet. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers back to Poland and Germany. Worst of all, the autumn rains had begun. Roads turned to rivers of mud. Tanks sank halfway to their holes. Trucks needed horse teams to pull them forward. The incredible speed of the early blitzkrieg vanished, replaced by a slow crawl. Yet Hitler remained fixated on Moscow. Finally, in early October, he launched Operation Typhoon, the assault on the Soviet capital. But now it was no longer the lightning strike he had envisioned in June. It was a race against time, mud, exhaustion, and a Soviet enemy that had refused to die. The window of vulnerability had closed. The road to Moscow was no longer open, it was booby-trapped by nature, manpower, and determination. The decisive battle of 1941 was coming. But the Germans would not fight it on the terms they had planned. On October 2, 1941, after weeks of being bogged down by mud, supply shortages, and the aftermath of the Kiev encirclement, the German army finally began the long-awaited assault on Moscow, Operation Typhoon. Hitler announced to the German people that the final decisive blow of the war had begun. His generals believed the same. They expected one last lightning strike to shatter Soviet resistance once and for all. The offensive opened with overwhelming force. German artillery pounded Soviet frontline positions along the Vyazma, Bryansk sectors. Luftwaffe squadrons swept overhead, targeting supply depots, rail lines, and command posts. For massive German armies, comprising nearly 2 million troops, moved forward, reinforced with hundreds of panzers and guns. But the Soviets were not caught off guard this time. General Georgy Zhukov had anticipated a renewed German push. He had spent September reinforcing defensive belts, constructing anti-tank ditches, and ordering the Red Army to fight from depth rather than rigidly cling to front-line positions. Even so, the German blow fell with punishing force. Within days, German armored formations executed two massive pincer movements. At Vyazma, for entire Soviet armies were encircled, nearly 500,000 troops trapped in a tightening ring of steel. At Bryansk, the same happened again. The Red Army was torn open, its front-line structure shredded. German commanders celebrated. They believed Moscow was finally within reach. But something crucial had changed since June. The Soviet Union had learned how to take hits, devastating hits, and still pull together a second, third, and fourth line of defense. For every encirclement, new Soviet units emerged. For every gap in the lines, fresh reserves filled it. The blitzkrieg was still powerful. But it no longer broke the Soviet state. It merely carved deeper into a nation that refused to die. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk were some of the largest in the early war. The German High Command viewed them as proof that Operation Typhoon would succeed. Columns of Soviet prisoners stretched for miles, hungry, exhausted men trudging under gray skies toward makeshift camps. German propaganda called it the final collapse of Bolshevism. But beneath the image of triumph lay a ticking clock. Fighting inside the pockets was brutal. Soviet troops, cut off from supplies, launched desperate breakout attempts. Some units hid in forests, emerging at night to strike German positions in guerrilla-style attacks. Others fought from village to village, refusing to surrender. These internal battles slowed the Germans more than expected. Meanwhile, German logistics were unraveling at the seams. Fuel trucks couldn't keep up. Ammunition wagons bogged down. Tire rubber cracked in the cold. Engines froze at night. Horses, vital to German supply movement, died from exhaustion or lack of fodder. The meticulously planned German timetable was collapsing. But worst of all was the weather. By mid-October, the Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian rain, returned with a vengeance. Roads dissolved into black rivers of mud. Tanks sank to their hulls. Horses drowned attempting to pull wagons through marshy terrain. Infantry marched ankle-deep in freezing sludge. Hans Reinhardt, a German corps commander, wrote, "Advancing 1 kilometer now feels like conquering a continent." The Soviets, retreating in better order than before, used the weather to their advantage. They blew bridges, mined crossroads, set forests ablaze, delayed the Germans at every opportunity. Germany had won another pair of great battles. But the cost was the one resource they needed most: time. By late October, the spires of Moscow were finally within German operational range. Panzer commanders could sense the city's gravitational pull, its roads, railways, and factories the ultimate prize of the campaign. But Moscow was no longer undefended. Zhukov had consolidated his lines. Civilians formed militia units known as Apolkani. Boys as young as 15 and men in their 60s joined the defensive works. Women dug anti-tank trenches by hand. Factory workers assembled rifles around the clock, some weapons still warm when handed directly to soldiers marching to the front. In the skies, the Soviet Air Force, previously devastated, began to recover. New aircraft, built in factories relocated east of the Urals, arrived in growing numbers. Pilots trained in weeks, not months, threw themselves into battle with alarming courage. Then, on October 15th, something happened that the Germans had not planned for. The first snow fell. Within hours, temperatures plummeted. Roads froze. Mud turned to sheets of ice. Engines refused to start. Fuel thickened. German troops, still dressed in light autumn uniforms, began to suffer frostbite. Winter clothing had been planned, but not shipped. Hitler had insisted the war would end before winter, so no winter gear had been issued. Soviet troops, hardened by their own winters, maneuvered with growing confidence. German troops began to slow, then stumble, then, at times, stop dead in their tracks. The city of Moscow braced for impact. The German army braced for a final push. The world held its breath. Operation Typhoon had reached its climax. But so had German strength. Winter was coming. And with it, the turning point of the entire war. The first snow should have been a warning. Instead, the German High Command urged their troops forward through the bitter cold, convinced that Moscow was within reach, that one final blow would collapse the Soviet state entirely. Orders from Hitler were unambiguous. Advance. No stopping. No retreat. So they advanced. German tanks, now struggling to start in the morning frost, moved in jerks and shudders across icy fields. Infantry marched with blankets tied around their shoulders, trying to keep warm. The cold air stung their lungs. Machine gun bolts froze in place. Artillery pieces had to be heated with fires before use. Trucks, low on fuel and lubricants, stalled constantly. Yet morale was mixed. Some soldiers believed they could see the faint glow of Moscow's lights on the horizon during clear nights. Others whispered that they were marching into a death trap. The Soviet resistance stiffened with every kilometer. Frontline Soviet units, reinforced by newly arriving Siberian troops, fought ferociously. These men were hardened by sub-zero winters and trained specifically for cold weather combat. Unlike the Germans, they wore warm quilted jackets, white camouflage cloaks, fur-lined boots, and felt gloves. German commanders noticed immediately. "These Siberians fight like wolves," one officer wrote. Meanwhile, civilians inside Moscow dug deeper defenses. Anti-tank ditches, trenches, barbed wire, and fortified roadblocks multiplied. Machine gun nests were installed inside apartment windows and factory floors. Churches, schools, and theaters were converted into strongpoints. As the temperature plunged toward -15 degrees Celsius, then -20 degrees Celsius, and even lower, both armies felt the pressure. But the Germans bore the brunt. Undersupplied, frostbitten, and exhausted, they kept pushing forward. Because Moscow was right there, so close that the very idea of turning back seemed impossible. In late November 1941, one of the most important shifts of the entire war unfolded quietly on the Soviet side. Fresh, fully equipped, battle-hardened divisions from Siberia and the Far East began arriving in Moscow. Their appearance was not an accident. Soviet intelligence, particularly through the famed spy Richard Sorg in Tokyo, confirmed that Japan did not intend to invade the Soviet Far East. With that threat eliminated, Stalin redeployed elite divisions westward. These men were trained to fight in temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius. They were expert marksmen. They were acclimated to snow, ice, and blizzards. And they arrived with excellent equipment, skis, white camouflage, padded winter uniforms, and powerful rifles. Their arrival transformed the defensive line. German scouts reported spotting entire Soviet units moving silently through snow-covered forests, almost invisible in white camouflage. They ambushed German supply convoys, attacked isolated outposts, and sniped from tree lanes at astonishing distances. Meanwhile, Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals, were producing rifles, mortars, ammunition, and even new tanks at a pace that astonished German intelligence. No matter how many Soviet units the Germans destroyed, new ones kept appearing. The Germans had reached the limit of their strength. The Soviets had not even reached the limit of their reserves. By late November, the fighting around towns like Klin, Istra, and Tula became savage. Street by street, house by house, forest by forest battles consumed both sides. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius and then -35 degrees Celsius. Frostbite casualties skyrocketed. While the Germans froze in inadequate clothing, the Siberians attacked at night with confidence, ghost-like, fast, deadly. The balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted. By early December 1941, the German army stood at the very edge of its ambition. Frontline units reached as close as 18 to 20 miles from the Kremlin. German officers claimed they could see the city's spires with binoculars on clear days. Propaganda units filmed soldiers pointing toward the skyline. But the reality on the ground was devastating. German divisions were at a fraction of their original strength. Some infantry regiments were down to 40% manpower. Panzer units had fewer than 30% of their tanks operational. Ammunition was rationed. Vehicles froze solid each night. Fuel reserves dwindled. Horses, essential for transport, died by the thousands. Frostbite amputations increased dramatically. Food shortages were severe. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion in the snow. Meanwhile, Moscow itself refused to fall. The city had been partially evacuated, but it lived and breathed defiance. Streetcars ran. Factories operated. Anti-aircraft guns stood on rooftops. Posters declared, "Not one step back. Moscow will never surrender." The Soviet defensive lines had transformed into vast, layered fortifications stretching across the landscape, trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, minefields, artillery nests. And the final blow to German hopes came on December 5, 1941. The temperature hit -40 degrees Celsius. Engines died permanently. Lubricants froze. Weapons jammed. Entire German battalions huddled in snowdrifts, unable to move. The Germans had reached their limit. The Soviet Union had not. The moment of reversal was coming. Within 48 hours, everything would change. For months, the German army had dictated the rhythm of the war, advancing relentlessly, crushing armies, encircling cities. But on the icy morning of December 5, 1941, the rhythm reversed. Without warning, the Soviet Union seized the initiative. At exactly 0600 hours, artillery roared across a 200-mile front. It was not a small demonstration. It was an enormous, coordinated barrage, thousands of guns firing in thunderous unison, sending shockwaves rolling across the frozen fields outside Moscow. German soldiers stared, stunned. They had expected Soviet defenses. They had not expected a full-scale counterattack. Moments later, Siberian infantry and freshly formed Soviet divisions stormed forward. They moved fast on skis and sleds, gliding over the deep snow that immobilized German vehicles. White camouflaged Soviet troops flanked German positions with eerie efficiency, emerging from tree lanes like ghosts. German defensive lines, already thin and frozen, buckled immediately under the shock. General Guderian wrote, "We had no proper winter clothing, little ammunition, and frozen weapons. The Russians attacked with ferocity. We could not hold. The Soviets attacked in waves, riflemen, ski troops, cavalry, then tanks. The cold no longer hindered them. It empowered them." Soviet soldiers were acclimated, properly clothed, equipped, and motivated by the belief that they were defending not just Moscow, but the heart of their homeland. German units began pulling back in disarray. Commanders radioed for reinforcements that no longer existed. Some units lost their positions without firing a shot, unable to operate weapons frozen solid at -40°C. The German offensive toward Moscow had not merely stalled. It had reversed. December 5 marked the moment the tide of the war began to turn. After the initial shock on December 5, the Red Army did not stop. For the first time in 6 months, they were advancing, not retreating. Soviet counterattacks erupted across the entire Moscow front. In the north near Kalinin, Soviet divisions smashed into overstretched German lines, forcing rapid withdrawals. In the center near Klen and Istra, entire German regiments were pushed back mile by mile through forests and villages choked with snow. The Soviets fought with a fury fueled by months of humiliation, loss, and destruction. Their tactics were swift and ruthless. Ski battalions bypassed frozen German roadblocks. Cavalry units struck retreating columns from the flanks. Tanks equipped for winter operations pressed forward without pause. Night raids became constant and terrifying. German forces fell back to avoid encirclement. The once proud panzer divisions, decimated by frost, attrition, and shortages, found themselves unable to hold against fresh Soviet formations. Meanwhile, Soviet morale soared. Each liberated village, each recaptured trench, each German retreat triggered cries of victory across the frozen countryside. Civilians emerged from hiding to embrace Soviet soldiers, offering bread, tea, and whatever food remained. The counteroffensive was not a single blow, it was a rolling wave, growing in force and confidence. Step by step, village by village, ridge by ridge, the Germans were pushed away from Moscow. The invincible Wehrmacht, the machine that had conquered Europe, was now retreating in winter desperation, leaving behind frozen vehicles, abandoned artillery, and soldiers too weak to walk. The world watched in astonishment. The Red Army had stopped the Germans. Now, it was driving them back. By mid-December, as the Soviet advance pressed westward, German commanders begged Hitler for permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. They saw their divisions collapsing. They saw frostbite crippling thousands. They saw ammunition depots empty. They saw the front falling apart. Hitler refused. No retreat. Not one step back. Hold every position at all costs. It was the most destructive order he had issued since the war began. German generals protested, Guderian, Kluge, Bach, and many others. They argued that standing still in -40°C temperatures without supplies was suicide. Many divisions would be wiped out if they didn't fall back in an organized fashion. But Hitler would not budge. So German soldiers, half-frozen, exhausted, starving, dug into the snow and tried to survive. They turned barns, broken vehicles, and haystacks into makeshift bunkers. Some froze to death overnight in their foxholes. Others died silently in their sleep, curled beneath blankets stiff with ice. Meanwhile, the Soviets advanced with growing pressure. New units, reinforcements, and armored brigades arrived daily. Factories deep inside the USSR were now operating at maximum capacity. The Red Army was becoming stronger as the German army crumbled. By January 1942, the Germans had been driven back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. Operation Typhoon had not only failed, it had nearly destroyed Germany's entire eastern force. And the war, once thought nearly won, had entered a new phase. A long, brutal struggle of endurance that neither side had fully prepared for. But the Soviet Union, against all odds, had survived the greatest threat in its history. As December turned to January 1942, the Eastern Front became something nature itself seemed intent on reclaiming. The worst Russian winter in decades descended on both armies, but only one of them was prepared for it. Temperatures plummeted beyond anything German meteorologists had predicted, 30 degrees C, 35 degrees C, and then, in some areas, a shattering minus 40 degrees Celsius. The cold was not just harsh. It was lethal. German soldiers woke to find their boots frozen stiff. Canteens turned into blocks of ice. Machine guns jammed after 2 or 3 shots. Steel became brittle enough to crack. The oil in tank engines thickened like tar. And worst of all, the German army, designed for a fast summer blitzkrieg, had been given no winter uniforms. Some regiments wrapped burlap around their legs. Others scavenged Soviet coats or women's shawls from abandoned villages. Many simply froze. At night, soldiers huddled in pairs, back to back, trying not to fall asleep, because sleep in that cold meant death. Entire squads were found at dawn curled together, snow covering them like a burial cloth. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers operated with growing confidence. They had white camouflage cloaks, padded jackets, felt boots, and fur hats. Their rifles and lubricants were designed to function at low temperatures. They lit small fires inside dugouts insulated with logs and snow. The cold punished both sides. But it annihilated only one. And amidst this frozen catastrophe, every German soldier slowly realized the truth. Hitler had led them into a war for which they were not equipped, not supplied, and not prepared to survive. By early January 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive had driven the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow. But what followed was not an orderly withdrawal. It was a desperate struggle to survive, one Hitler refused to acknowledge. German commanders pleaded for permission to establish shorter, more defensible lines. They needed to regroup, resupply, and prevent further collapse. But Hitler, still clinging to the fantasy of a renewed summer advance, issued a single, catastrophic order. Stand fast. Not one step back. This was not strategy. It was denial. German divisions, already reduced to half strength or worse, were forced to hold exposed positions on open ground. Many units found themselves isolated in pockets, towns, ridges, or forest clearings surrounded on all sides by Soviet forces. With no ability to maneuver, they became targets for encirclement. But somehow, miraculously, many held out. German engineers carved fortresses out of frozen earth. Machine gun teams stuffed straw into their uniforms to fight frostbite. Artillery units used campfires to warm gun barrels before firing. Officers walked the trenches at night, shaking men awake so they wouldn't freeze. In some villages, German soldiers fought from house to house, sleeping in barns or burned-out huts, their breath turning to frost in the air. They rationed ammunition to a handful of bullets per day. They burned furniture, books, even floorboards to stay alive. The Soviet advance slowed, not because they lacked determination, but because winter punished them too. Supply lines froze. Vehicles broke down. Horses collapsed. And the Red Army, though resilient, was still learning how to wage large-scale winter offensives. Both armies bled. Both armies froze. But only one army remained on the verge of utter collapse. Yet the line held, thin, fragile, and trembling, but it held. By February 1942, the world understood what Hitler refused to admit. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The invincible Wehrmacht, the machine that conquered Poland in weeks, France in 6, and Yugoslavia in 11 days, had been humbled outside Moscow. The snow-covered fields of Russia had swallowed Germany's finest generals, its most elite divisions, and the illusions of easy victory. Hitler blamed the weather. He blamed his generals. He blamed the hardiness of the Russian soldier. He blamed everyone except himself. But the truth was visible on every frozen road and battlefield. Thousands of abandoned German tanks and trucks. Entire divisions shattered beyond recognition. Soldiers wearing rags where uniforms once were. Frostbitten men with blackened fingers and missing toes. Endless miles of graves marked with wooden crosses sticking out of snow. The Eastern Front had become something new. Not a campaign. Not an invasion. But a war of annihilation that neither side could escape. And yet, despite the catastrophic losses, Hitler did not retreat strategically, rethink his goals, or negotiate. Instead, he made a fateful decision that would shape the rest of the war. He doubled down. The war would continue. The front would expand. Millions more would die. And the Eastern Front would become the most brutal theater in human history. But in the winter of 1941, something monumental had already happened. The German war machine had broken its momentum. The Soviets had survived the storm. And history had turned. The ghosts of 1941 whisper a warning even today. A warning about hubris, ambition, and the cold truths that empires try to ignore. The winter of 1941 did more than stop an army. It shattered illusions. It rewrote destinies. It proved that even the most powerful war machine in the world could freeze, falter, and fail when confronted with a people who refused to surrender. What began as a lightning strike meant to crush a nation became a brutal, grinding war of survival, one that would stretch across continents, consume millions of lives, and reshape the world forever. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, and Berlin. Ahead lay the collapse of the Third Reich and the rise of a new global order. Ahead lay battles more savage, more desperate, and more decisive than anything seen in 1941. History does not move in straight lines. It jerks, it shakes, it screams. And now, with the turning point reached, the Eastern Front was preparing for its deadliest chapters. If you followed this journey from the first shot of Operation Barbarossa to the frozen trenches outside Moscow, then you already know this story is bigger than armies and leaders. It's about humanity, endurance, and the high cost of ambition. So don't stop here. If you want part 2, covering Stalingrad, Kursk, and the fall of Nazi Germany, make sure to like the video, drop a comment, subscribe for the next chapter, and share this story so others can learn from the past. Because the ghosts of 1941 are still speaking. And the road ahead will only get darker, bloodier, and more unforgettable. Stay with us. Part 2 is coming.